Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. In December of 1966, I received a notice from St. John's Law School, where I just finished my first semester, that I was academically expelled. Well, that was a shock. I won't go into the details except to say I was shocked. And my immediate reaction after the shock was I got to find another law school, because I dearly and devotedly wanted to be a lawyer and I wanted to go to law school. And it was in the middle of the Vietnam War, and they were drafting people left and right for that effort. And I'm not unpatriotic, but I had no desire to go to Vietnam. I thought the whole thing was a big diplomatic mistake on our part. And even the man, I think it was Professor Kennan, who wrote the theory of containment that our government followed as policy, said that Vietnam was really, Vietnam going communist was not part of what he called the domino effect. It was a backwater, and it wouldn't have any effect other than local effect. And it was nothing to worry about. And here we were, deeply invested in that war, which, everybody knows about. And it's common knowledge that was a tragic mistake on our part, on our foreign policy. Well, that still left me with the necessity of doing something because I wanted to preserve my status as not going into the draft so that I could pursue the idea of law school. The first thing that came to mind was being hired by the New York City Board of Ed. They had some teaching jobs that were draft deferred. So I went to Graduate School of Education. I took some courses right away at St. John's for 6 months. That was draft deferred. And then I got hired by the New York City Board of Education, which was known at that time. And they sent me to District 7 in the South Bronx because it was draft deferred. And it was draft deferred because it was a war zone, literally. As a point of fact, it's interesting to know that the armed forces used to brag that any member of the military who was wounded in Vietnam would be in a field hospital within an average of 7 minutes. Whereas in IS 38, Intermediate School 38, where I was sent, there was no telling. You could be stabbed by one of the students, shot by one of the students, and end up in a hallway and bleeding out with nobody even know it happened until a week later. IS 38 itself was in the South Bronx, as I said, and it was called Fort Apache. It wasn't Fort Apache when I got there in 1967, September, but it became Fort Apache within the next year when the 41st Precinct was attacked. There was a false rumor, it turned out to be a false rumor, of police brutality. The neighborhood went berserk. People surrounded the precinct house and put it under siege. They started firing at the cops. And it was like a cowboy movie. And that's how the place got its name. It was a wry, the wry sense of police humor. And they called it Fort Apache. And it kept that name until many, many years later when they leveled the South Bronx decades later. And the cops changed Fort Apache's name to the Little House on the Prairie. And anyway, at that time, the streets of the South Bronx were desolate. This is when they said the Bronx was burning. Well, the Bronx was burning because a lot of empty buildings were burned down by their owners for the insurance money. The streets were absolutely empty. They were very, very violent. The only thing that populated the streets were rats, drugs, and gangs. Again, charred out, abandoned buildings. People over there, the neighbors or the neighborhood, the kids started burning down buildings for sport along with the insurance fires. And so when the fire department came, they would stone them from the rooftops of neighboring buildings, so that the fire department then had to put on most of its ladders canopies, which would protect the firemen that were hanging on the back on straps from falling objects that were thrown off the roofs. It was really a madhouse. There were very, very few stores there. Maybe there was an isolated bodega here and there. There were no other merchants. There was one remaining, kind of a vestigial organ, an Italian deli, because IS 38 was on the back of it, was on the Brook Avenue, and there was a commercial rail yard, and which was the site of a Bronx wholesale meat market. Stuff used to come in, the meat used to come in the carloads on railroad cars, and there was sidings there, and there was a big work industry going on, but they were self-contained. And that deli was left over. And I used to get my lunch there. It was the only decent food in the neighborhood for miles. And I send the two toughest kids, or the second and third toughest kid in the school, I would give them a quarter apiece for themselves. And a kid named Leroy Fields and another boy named Ronald Frazier. And they would get my lunch. And they wouldn't be mugging other kids because I gave them a quarter each as tribute or as a service fee. Well, when I got there, I remember it was so bad that it was only May, and I had spoken to a couple of cops when I was escorting one kid who stabbed a teacher. I had to accompany him to the precinct so that it wouldn't get worse. And the cops told me that there were 76 homicides in the little 41st precinct in May of that year, and that was when the year was just starting. It was just warming up. The summer is hot, blazing, and damp summer in New York is when homicides really, really climb. And the neighborhood, the problem with the South Bronx was unlike Harlem. Harlem had Black Harlem and Spanish Harlem, and they had institutionalized both neighborhoods. There were churches and businesses, long-standing community organizations, whereas in the South Bronx, it was in a state of flux. The neighborhood was 60-40 Puerto Rican and Black African Americans, and the mix was not from one section to another section, but building to building. So there was constant friction and cultural clashes going on. A Black guy would come down from his apartment house only to see 5 Puerto Rican guys sitting or leaning on his car, and he would get excited and violence would break out, or vice versa. And as I said, there were cultural differences. There was tremendous friction from house to house. And I remember Black guys used to complain about the Puerto Ricans, saying the Puerto Ricans would stick you or stab you. Whereas in Black culture, the idea was to slash somebody. It was to harm them, but not, more superficially in nature. And they didn't understand how Puerto Ricans wanted to stab people when all you had to do was slash somebody. I mean, that was just a minor cultural difference, but it wasn't so minor. The neighborhood was a horror show. I mentioned the one young man was the third toughest guy in the school. The toughest kid in the school was a girl named Doris Blake. And it's no surprise in Black neighborhoods because due to the welfare system, a lot of the Black homes and families were fatherless by design or just by circumstance. And Black society up there was a matriarchy, and the women gave all the orders, and the women ran, and they were the glue of the whole family structure up there. And a lot of those women were absolute heroes in having to raise any number of kids with no man around in a tough, drug-filled and violence-filled neighborhood. It was really something. Well, the number 3 toughest kid in the school, Ronald Frazier, was killed. And it turns out he was killed by his mother's boyfriend. How did I know? Because I knew one of the detectives up there from my Flushing neighborhood, a guy named Leroy Hyam, God rest his soul. And Leroy told me they had solved it. And I said, do you have to get rough with people to get information? You have to bend arms, break heads. What do you do? He says, nah, that's old-fashioned. We don't do that up here. In the 41st precinct, he said, no threats are necessary if you want information. I said, really? How do you do that? He says, we simply tell whoever it is we're questioning, listen, you want to tell me what's going on confidentially, or do you want us to take you to the station house and keep you there for up to 48 hours while we question you? And when you come home, because you're going to tell us after 48 hours anyway, and when you come home, your apartment's going to be empty. Your sofa's going to be gone. Your television's going to be gone. Your refrigerator's going to be gone. Your record player, your boombox, everything's going to be gone. And it was true. So nobody wanted to leave. So almost invariably, we would get quick results on any inquisition that we made without any violence at all. Well, IS 38 itself, the building was imposing. It was dark and foreboding. It was 5 stories high. It took up a whole block on St. Anne's Avenue between 156th Street and Russ Street. There were no elevators in the building. It was an old building. And it was dark and ominous looking. As I said, the back was adjoining the rail yards, the wholesale meat market on Brook Avenue. And the building, later on, in my law practice, I had to go to Lewisburg Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, which was a Civil War-era prison turned into a federal penitentiary. And thinking back, IS 38 looked just like Lewisburg. It was a fearsome sight. The principal was a limousine liberal from some North Shore community on Long Island, Gold Coast, and the kids hated his guts. They called him Bulldog Face. That was his name among all the students. He would try to come and enter my classroom to drop in and make the rounds, and the kids would bar him at the door and say, Bulldog Face, what do you want? And he would say he wants to come in, and the kids would ask me, Mr. Greco, Bulldog Face is here. They'd do this right in front of him and say, shall we let him in? You want us to let him in? And I would have to motion and say, let him in. And they held him in high esteem. They held him in such high esteem that they broke into his office on the weekend and smeared it with human excrement, the entire office. Well, I was a new teacher, and I had a history license, and we show up 3 days before the children show up in school and start their first day of school. And you come in because you get assignments for your program, what you're going to teach and what hours you're going to teach, and when are your break times and when's your lunch time. You get classroom assignments. They called me down to the principal's office, and there he was with a couple assistant principals and said, Rudy, we'd like you to teach. We know you have a history license and you're scheduled to teach history, but we're short. One phys ed teacher. Somebody was supposed to come here and decided against it. Well, that was no surprise. Nobody wanted to go there. They didn't have to go there. I had to go there. And we have a phys ed position open. And you have a boxing and football coaching background, and maybe you'd like to do this. I said, well, I don't know anything about it. They said, well, first of all, in half the classes, you're going to be the lead teacher and actually do the teaching, but that's only half the time. The other time, you're going to be the assist. You'll do the administrative work. You'll watch the locker rooms and make sure kids come up wearing sneakers or in their stocking feet. And the other times, you'll take attendance and you'll help out the lead teacher. And, by the way, the phys ed department in IS 38, Bronxland Junior High School is what they called it, although it was a middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. They said it's the best department in the school. And that was sadly true. It was, because all of the phys ed teachers who were there, my predecessors, had actually been licensed in teaching physical education. And they were all superb athletes, and they were male and female, and they knew what they were doing. And they had a terrific organized program. And everybody there really learned, and I'll get into that in a moment. And each class would consist of 75 to 90 teens, 5 classes, 5 homeroom classes of boys segregated, or 5 homeroom classes of girls. And I even had to teach girls because they were short one female teacher, so I was the lead in the female class, one female class also. And I said, well, does this entail wearing a suit and tie? No. You just come in chinos and sneakers and a polo shirt. I said, well, that's the clincher. All right, I'll give it a try. If you say so, you think I can do it, and it's a good department, I'll give it a try. And they were right. It was a good department. And the problem was he's teaching kids in that school from 6th, 7th, and 8th grade from 12 to 15 years old, which is a very, very difficult age. It's the toughest age to teach in the entire teaching spectrum. Why? Because the boys at that age, everybody's got raging hormones. These are all kids that are tweens or teens, and all the boys are gangbusters. Everybody's into fighting and mischief and crime, whatever they can cook up. And the girls were all boy crazy. That's all they thought about were boys. But the school year up there for phys ed, I told you they had a very good and well-organized program. It was 10 monthly units. The first and the last, in September and in June, involved swimming. We would take the kids 5 blocks away to St. Mary's Park, where they had a public parks department pool. And every kid in that school learned to swim, which was really for inner city kids, that was a very commendable thing. For any kids, it's a commendable thing. And they had great way of teaching the kids. The beginners were called frogs, the intermediates were called dolphins, and the advanced swimmers were called sharks. So all of them wanted to be sharks. Everybody wants to be a shark, and there was great impetus for the kids to come along and do well. The rest of the school year, the other 8 units, comprised of softball, basketball, soccer, football, gymnastics, track and field. And at the end of each of those sections or units would end in competition. And the top 6th grade class would then meet the top 7th grade class for the honor of playing against or meeting or competing against the top 8th grade class in a school championship. You couldn't keep those kids out of school. The problem was, even in blizzards, they would show up if they had phys ed that day. They would show up because they loved the phys ed program. It was really, really well organized and well done. So it was pretty good. There were some difficulties in being an assist. For instance, I was an assist in one class, and I was in the locker room, and it was snowing out. And one little boy came, and he had on rubber boots, rain boots, like Wellingtons, I guess you'd call them. And he spoke very little English. He was in a non-English speaking class. The kid was fresh up from Puerto Rico, so they're very mild-mannered kids, and they're very sweet until they're here about a year. Same thing with the black kids who came up, all the African-American kids who came up from down south, Mississippi or Arkansas or Alabama. They were very, very mild-mannered until they were here about a year, and then it would start getting brassy and pick up New York habits. But anyway, this little guy had on rubber boots, and I said to him, "Take off the boots." I pointed to his boots, and he walked away from me. And a few more kids passed by, and then he tried to get by me again. And I stopped him. I said, "Take off the boots." He went back. He retreated. The rest of the class got by, went up the stairs to the gym, and he was the last guy. And it was a face-off, me and him. And I told him, "Take off the boots." And he looked at me. He had this forlorn look on his face, and he took off his boots. And this was in the middle of a snowstorm. He had no shoes and no socks. I hugged the kid, and I said, "It's okay." And I told him in Spanish, "Vaya, let's go. No problem, no problemo," And the kid put on his rubber boots. That broke my heart. And another instance was when I was the lead teacher of one of the girls, my first girls' class. I had an assist for the locker room, Dolores Fontana, who would supervise the girls changing into their gym outfits, etc., etc. And I had eighth grade girls, and these girls were 15 going on 35. They were advanced. Some of them were married. Some of them had babies. It was wild. And I came out of the male locker room, and the class was all out there, and they all started wolf whistles and cat calls and everything else. And I thought maybe I forgot my bathing suit or something like that. I was so embarrassed. I just kind of crouched and turned, and they started laughing. They had the most wonderful time at my expense. Well, you have a homeroom class. I always had a homeroom class. Every teacher has one where the kids come, you take attendance, they hang up their coats, they get their books, and they go on, and then they come back at lunchtime and then go to the cafeteria. They come back after lunch, and they come back after school to pick up their coats and go home. And good old Board of Ed, everything is ass backwards in the Board of Ed. I'm a brand new teacher, no teaching experience whatsoever, and they give me what is euphemistically called an adjustment class. What's an adjustment class? It means some of the kids in that class were truants for the last 3 or 4 years. Some of them came from criminal or youth criminal facilities like Spofford, which was a youth detention center, which was only a few blocks away from our school. Had citywide kids from that got thrown out of or did criminal acts around the school, juveniles. I think we had a couple of kids that were raised by the wolves. I think they were feral children and raised by the wolves in the Bronx Zoo. I'm not sure. But good old Board of Ed, instead of giving the toughest classes to the veteran teachers and paying them an increment because of their expertise, they give all the toughest classes to brand new teachers, which is a horror show. Again, it's ass backwards. Well, my own kids, turns out the girls were terrific. They weren't really a problem at all. But the boys were a handful. And I had all kinds of characters in my class. I had one gang, 5 African-American kids that were a clique. I call them the Dead End Gang. One of them was Rockhead. One of them was Charcoal. The other guy was Cooper Lips. The other guy was Pigpen. And the last one was Ray Charles. And he had a last name, but he couldn't spell it. And he was a big kid. He was 6'2", 225 pounds. And he just used Ray Charles. And he would sit in the back of the room. And every time I would discipline one of the other kids, he had this basso profundo voice from the back of the room, and he would go get him, Mr. Greco, and I would start laughing, Then we had one kid, Carlos, who was a pickpocket, and every day, without my knowing, he would pick my pocket and take my pen while I was holding, the homeroom class, and on the way out, he would give me the pen. He would smile and say, "Here's your pen, Mr. Greco," because he picked my pocket. And we had another little guy who had bangs. He was a little kid. He was not even 4 feet high. And his name was Arcadio Torres. But he went by the name of Cato, after a movie character who was famous for his karate. I think it was, I forget, was the Green Hornet's sidekick in Hollywood movie fame. And Cato, he would go around the school, he'd take his role seriously, and give karate chops the bigger kids and yelled karate, hit him, and run. And his answer to everything was running away. And if they ever caught him, they would mangle this guy, but nobody could catch him. He would run away, and everybody then they would kind of laugh. They'd be annoyed, but they would laugh. And a couple of years later, there was a train station not far from our school, 149th Street and 3rd Avenue. It was a big shopping center in the South Bronx. And the police came, they found Cato, and they brought him to school. He was at the foot of the elevated stairway with his trademark overcoat. He had a little oversized overcoat, which he wore even in the summertime. It was right down to his ankles. And there he was with dark glasses, pretending he was blind with a little tin cup, collecting money. And they brought him back to school. He was quite a character. And another young lady, Millie, was in my class. This was in the 6th grade. And Millie comes in, very, very pretty young girl. She was probably 13 or 14 at the time. And Millie came in with a note. And she says, Mr. Greco, I have a note for you. I said, what is it, Millie? She says, here, read it. And the note said, Mr. Greco, Millie can't come to school anymore. She has to stay home and clean the house and cook. And it was signed. And I said, who signed this? She said, oh, that's my husband. I just got married. And my family knows. And no, I'm not pregnant. She says, I just got married. And Millie never came to class anymore. And had another kid, Edwin Hernandez, who, I don't know, he was a misfit because he really had no problems. And most of the boys in my class had problems. But Edwin didn't. The first week I was in school, I collected knives. I filled up a small, or actually not so small, basket, like a strawberry basket that they have in farmers markets. And it was oblong, and it was about probably 18 inches long. I filled it up with knives that I confiscated from the kids. And I said, no knives. And Edwin, at the end of the week, I was confiscating his 3rd knife. And I said, Edwin, what's the problem? I told you, and I got 2 of your knives already. He said, oh, Mr. Greco, you don't understand. I said, what don't I understand? He goes, I have to carry a knife. I said, why? He said, because you see my leather jacket that I got on? If I go home without a knife, I get mugged and they take my leather jacket. He says, so I got to protect my leather. I have to have a knife. So from then on, I made a rule in the classroom that everybody could have knives if they had them, but I didn't want to see them. If I saw them, I would confiscate them. Well, I made a rookie mistake after 3 weeks in my homeroom. I kept a pretty tight rope on the whole, pretty tight line on the discipline. And I started to ease up, figuring the class had got the message. And it got worse and worse and worse, and the whole thing deteriorated until it was chaotic. I let the girls go home at 3 o'clock, and I shut the door. There was only one door. It's an ancient classroom. And I threw a tantrum. I had a meltdown. I was manhandling kids left, right, and sideways. The little ones, the big ones, it didn't matter. I even managed, in my fury, to lift and drop a whole corner of the Board of Ed oak desk, and those things weigh hundreds of pounds. I was furious. Finally, I just let all of the kids out, and I said, get out of here. I don't even want to look at you people anymore. I was disgusted. I let them out. The other teachers they didn't know what to do, but my door was locked. I let the kids go out, and I straightened out. I rearranged all the desks. They're all movable. I put everything back in order. And 15 minutes later, I walk outside the school, and there's the entire class, the boys, 16 of them, waiting outside. And I thought, uh-oh, this is going to be big trouble. And I'm thinking, how am I going to protect myself from this mob? And all of a sudden, one boy blurts out, why are you getting mad at us, man? What's the matter with you, Mr. Gregory? You don't have to be like that. And they started crying. They were upset that I had gotten so upset with them. And they forgave me everything. And we reestablished the whole order at that point in time. And it was a great, great lesson in the kids. Psychology, if they like you, you can pretty much get away with anything. Well, the first day of school, getting back to the first day, I was in my polo shirt, chinos, and sneakers, as I was instructed to do. And I cut through. I went from homeroom class in the morning right through the student cafeteria to the gym. It was a shortcut. And as I did that, one of the female teachers, I didn't know who she was, grabbed me by the collar and said, are you in 7-1? You have a seat right over here and say nothing until I talk to you. And I said, uh-oh, I'm in big trouble. Why? Because At 23 years old, she thought I was one of the kids. I looked like one of the kids, and the kids thought I was one of the kids, and that was good and it was bad. It was a double-edged sword. Anyway, I go on to the gym classes, and the first year I was pretty much the toughest kid in the school. I literally had to punch my way through the school. It was really, really rough. They gave me and another new teacher the toughest class of all. It was a conglomerate of 5 of 8th grade classes, which were the worst 8th grade classes. There were like 12 on the grade, and this was the worst ones. And we had them for 2 double periods a week, and we had to control those guys. And it was nothing but trouble because kids thought I was one of the kids. The Puerto Rican kids thought I was Puerto Rican. The girls thought I was their boyfriend, and they would try to button my coat, and there was all kinds of goings on. And you had to be very careful handling the kids for different reasons. But I learned some of the tricks. And in the boys' 8th grade class, we got the 2 toughest kids in the class to discipline the whole class. When we go swimming and march 5 blocks, we put the 2 guys in front and let them do the discipline. And if anybody talked or got out of line, we simply stopped the line, and they would go down the line, and they would make sure everybody behaved themselves. On the girls' class, I had 8th grade girls, and the toughest kid was Doris Blake. And Doris would control the whole class because on Friday afternoon, the second double period session that we had, if the class had been good for the 3 other periods prior to that, we would let the girls play music and dance. So everybody wanted to dance, and they wanted to teach me all the steps, and we had great, great fun doing all of that. So you had to use a lot of psychology, and it worked. It was fantastic. I remember taking a couple of class trips that were memorable. Once we went to the Met Museum, and the guards came over, the Metropolitan Museum, and complimented me and said, you know, you got one of the best behaved classes. These kids are teenagers, and you got one of the best behaved classes of all. What's the secret? I said, well, they're just good kids. They listen. The fact of the matter was, I had primed them and told them that the Egyptian section of the Met Museum had a real mummy. And they did. And I said, the mummy's going to be the last thing we see. And if anybody misbehaves, we're not going to see the mummy. And you can blame whoever it is that's out of line for not seeing the mummy. So everybody wanted to see the mummy. They were all big horror movie fans. And that kept them in line. And then once we went to the Bronx Zoo for an outing, and I had to stop them. 5 of them had surrounded the peacock. And I think they were going to try and take feathers from the peacock. But I stopped them in time. That was a close call. And in the Bronx Zoo, they have a concession selling food, sandwiches and cupcakes and candy and potato chips, etc. And I turned my back, and I turned my back again, only to see Carlos, the pickpocket, at the head of a line, shoplifting everything he could find, passing it behind his back down a bucket brigade style line to the kids on the outside. And Ray Charles was on the other end with a shopping bag, filling it up with stolen treats. And then I had to stop that. We had any number of memorable moments. And one of them was a guy in the first day in the bad gym class, in my first day of school. I had an altercation with this guy, and I punched him out in front of all his friends. And he went to jail 3 weeks later for stabbing a teacher, and came back a year later. And I was coming back from a bodega across the street from the school where I bought my coffee. And this guy, his name was Neil, he was waiting there with 4 friends. And he had just gotten out of Spofford. He had been there for a year. And I'm expecting the worst, given my past record with this guy. And I'm thinking, I don't know what's going to happen, but if I live, I'll get revenge. I don't know how. And I walk up, I put on a brave face because he's right in the doorway. I can't get around him. And he goes, Mr. Greco, you remember me? I said, Neil, how could I forget you? He says, yo, he turns to his friends. He says, I just got out of Spofford. And he turns to his friends. And he says, Mr. Greco, you see this guy? This MF, he crazier than me. Don't ever mess with Mr. Greco. And I said, well, Neil, I'm happy to see you again. How about going to class? Yeah, I'm going to catch class later this afternoon. I'm busy right now. I said, okay, see you later. And I was kind of relieved. It didn't get worse. One Christmas, the last day of school, Doris Blake's brother, big kid, Edgar, 15-year-old kid, 6'2", comes to my homeroom class when I had just dismissed the class for the holidays. I'm the last guy in the class, and he's got on a long leather coat. And he's got something underneath it. And I don't know if it was a gun, a knife, or what it was. He said, I want to talk to you. And I'm trying to think, did I have any altercation with this kid? Which I didn't. And I said, yeah, what is it, Edgar? He says, here. And he hands me an unwrapped gift box of JD's Cosmetics, shaving cream, cologne, deodorant stick, what have you, talcum powder. I said, "What is this?" He said, "Merry Christmas, man." I says, "Edgar, where did you get this?" He says, "What are you, a cop? Just take it. Merry Christmas, okay?" And walked away. I was very, very touched. Another young man, Miguel, was a good friend of mine. He was a good kid. He used to call me Primo. Primo is cousin in Spanish. All the kids called me Primo, a lot of them, because they thought I was Puerto Rican. I would try to explain that I was of Sicilian extraction and try to explain the difference. I said, I'd be proud to be Puerto Rican. There's nothing wrong with it. It's good. You got great music, great beaches, great food. Why not? But they called me Primo. And it was Primo, Miguel, who comes to me and says, "Primo, let me hold $1. I'll pay you back tomorrow." I said, "Sure." And I gave it to him, knowing that this was the last day of school in June. There was no tomorrow. Well, I gave him $1. It didn't matter. The kid needed $1, no problem. And first day of school in September, I run into him, Miguel, and he says, "Where you been, man? I've been looking for you all summer. I got your $1 right here." And it was September, and he paid me back. He said, "I don't want you saying I didn't pay you back." I said, "Okay, Miguel." And that was the kind of kid some of those kids were. Another instance, I was walking down the hall, and two little twin sisters, Sheila and Sharon Smith, two young African American kids, little bitty kids, they were on my Black Diamonds volleyball team. And they say, "Good morning, Mr. Greco," both of them speaking in tandem. And there's a woman in the hallway whom I didn't recognize, a very, very large woman. And she turns around, she says, "Excuse me, you Mr. Greco?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm Bertha Cooper, Anthony's mother." Well, Anthony had been in my homeroom. I can't tell you how many times I laid hands on Anthony and gave him cocotazos. Cocotazos, I used to turn my college ring around facing my palm and pat him on the back of the head with the heavy ring, you know? And Bertha Cooper said, and she wheels Anthony around. He was hiding behind her, and she was massive. So he was a skinny little kid, a very light-skinned black kid. And Anthony, she says, "Anthony, I know you love the children's, Mr. Greco, because Anthony be talking about you every day. Every day he comes home, Mr. Greco done this. Today, Mr. Greco done that, and Mr. Greco done this." Now, Anthony is mortified. He's light-skinned, I said, and he's flush red. He's just so embarrassed by his mother revealing that he actually liked me. And she said, I just want you to know, if my son Anthony gets out of line, you got my permissions. You just slap him right upside his effing head." I said, "Okay, Miss Cooper." I said, "I don't think that'll be." Anthony was nearly losing his footing there with now that I had license to use my hands on him after 2 years with no license. But I said, "I don't think that's necessary." Anthony and I long ago reached an understanding, Miss Cooper. He's a good, your son is a good kid, and I like him a lot. And then I was coaching after school. This is my third year. My last year I was there. I coached the Black Diamonds volleyball team, and they named themselves. These are the best. These kids, as you can tell, they're African-American kids, very athletic. Doris Blake was the leader, once again. And we used to have half the on Wednesday and Friday afternoons, we'd have the afternoon center. They'd have an after-school center that was open. And our afternoon center in the school looked like the New York Knicks. We had a lot of unemployed guys in their 20s come and play basketball in the gym, in the winter weather especially. And two of them said good night, and again, and this guy, I was escorting them to the door in the foyer, getting them out safely. And this large, young African-American guy, the guy looked like probably like an NFL tackle. I mean, he was big. He was about 230 and about 6'5". And he turns around, and he's looking at me. I said, "Excuse me, can I help you?" And meanwhile, my mind was racing because I thought maybe, just maybe, I had put my hand. I'm looking for a family resemblance. Is there any younger kid that I know that looks like this guy that I might have, messed up? I'm going to have to defend myself here. And the guy looks at me. I says, "Is there any problem?" He goes, "No. Crap, I heard about you. I thought you was 10 feet tall." I said, "Well, I'm really sorry to disappoint you, my friend. Have a nice evening." And I had a big smile and sigh of relief, and I got out of there. Well, I dearly miss those kids. I don't miss the administration and the nonsense that went on with the Board of Education and the bureaucracy. It was horrible. But the kids were fantastic. And I learned a few things that have stayed with me even to this time. And that is, even in the worst neighborhood, there were kids there that were clean. They had old clothes, but their clothes were clean. Their shoes were shined, even if they were old. And these kids were on grade in math. They were on grade verbally or above, and they had manners, and you could scold them, and they would react in appropriately and hang their heads or anything like that. And what did they have in common? All of those kids, they had one adult, just one. Most of them didn't have two. Just one adult. It may not even been a mother or a father. It could have been a grandmother, an aunt, a cousin, a neighbor, a big sibling, an older sibling. They had one adult who cares. And kids are like clay. And they turn out, you get them at an early age, they turn out how they're shaped by their environment and their families and the people around them. And the other thing is, kids have radar, and they can see right into your heart. If you love them, and you are fair, you're just, and you're consistent with them, they'll forgive you anything. They need structure, and they'll forgive anything wrong that you do, as long as they know what's in your heart, and your heart is true. One last point, and my experience in the South Bronx stood me in good stead. After controlling 75 to 90 teenagers with raging hormones in phys ed class, controlling any courtroom of unruly lawyers and litigants was a snap. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.